This is an interview with Mr. Jim Fuller from the Great Australian Mushroom Company, wholesale traders based in Melbourne. Jim, when are mushrooms in season?
You've got wild mushrooms in season here in Australia, typically from about April through July. In your busy seasons, you can have mushrooms that entire time, but in light fruiting seasons, which happen probably every second year, you might only see wild mushrooms around for about a month out of that. This year has been particularly good, and we've had months all the way through that entire period, and we expect them to be up until August. Now that's just with your wild. You've got your exotic mushrooms that are available year-round for the most part. There are a few exotic mushrooms like yellow oysters, pink oysters. They're really temperature dependent, and they like the hotter seasons, so they don't do too well in the wintertime, and right now they've been not available for about 3 weeks. You've also got your namikos, which like the cold, and they don't do so well in the summertime, and you got your chestnuts that like the warm, and they don't do so well in the wintertime. Other than that, you've got a year-round supply of shiitake, enoki, and oysters.
When are white button mushrooms and Swiss browns available?
The white mushrooms and the Swiss mushrooms are available year-round because they're cultivated indoors. We're not dependent on the weather or environmental conditions for those. We have multiple suppliers across the country, so we have a plentiful supply throughout the year with those types of mushrooms.
And when you buy those mushrooms in the shops, Jim, what do you look for when you buy them?
When I'm looking for those mushrooms, across the board, I'm looking for a mushroom that's heavy and dense. With the white ones, I'm looking for tight, white, and bright.
Okay. And so once you've got these mushrooms at home, how would you cook a white button mushroom? How would you cook one?
With the white mushrooms, there's a couple of great ways to cook them to draw out the most flavor possible. What you want to avoid is getting those slippery, wet, gray, rubbery things in your pan. So a mushroom is really a meat whenever you think about how you cook it. You cook it really hard, fast, and hot. It loves members of the onion family like onions, garlic, shallots, and it loves herbs like thyme, and it likes a bit of acid like white wine or lemon. And those are all things that I incorporate in cooking these types of mushrooms. So stir-fried or your typical sauté. They love a bit of tasty fat. If you like to add it, that would be your butter or your bacon drippings, but you go the healthier option with your extra virgin olive oil.
Okay, and what about a method you showed me with the using porcini?
Porcini mushrooms can be used to add flavor to any mushroom dish. Now, it really depends on how you like to use those porcinis, but there's a really good way to get value for those, because buying porcini mushrooms is quite expensive in the dried form. However, if you take your porcini mushrooms and pulverize them or mash them up in a coffee grinder and get a powder out of them, you can use those as a flavoring agent to any of your mushroom dishes. Now, with a particular method with the agaricus mushrooms, I like to take porcinis that have been dried, soak them in a small amount of boiling water, which will extract some flavor into the liquid. You'll go through a typical sauté of your agaricus mushroom and then add that liquid that you use to rehydrate the porcini mushrooms. Once all that liquid's evaporated out, you can add your garlic and your herbs, and then at the very end you sprinkle with a bit of that porcini dust, and you have a magical dish.
And would you add any butter to that dish at the end of the dish, or would you just serve it as is?
Depending on who I'm serving, if I'm serving a health-conscious person, I would sprinkle with a bit of EVOO. Otherwise, of course, a little healthy dollop of butter after taking off the flame adds to the creamy silkiness of the dish.
Thanks, Jim. And what about the exotic mushrooms, Jim? I mean, I don't know how to cook them. How would you cook exotic mushrooms? The shiitakes and the oysters and the enokis.
All right, well, interesting you bring those up, because those three in particular have three very different textures, and they cook in very different ways. I'll start with the enoki. The enoki is one mushroom that you typically like to use fresh because it's nice, fresh, and crisp when in fresh form. If you cook it, it goes rubbery and hard. So if you do cook it, you only drop it in at the end of your cooking method, and that's usually in a soup. Otherwise, you use your enoki fresh in salads, wrap them up with a bit of prosciutto, something like that, a very fresh tasting dish. Oysters are a bit more fragile. But they do lend themselves to heavy types of cooking. But with the fragility of the mushroom in mind, you go through quick, hot, fast, stir-frying type cooking with oysters. And with shiitakes, they're typically meatier, and you can give those to your multitude of cooking methods: braising, sautéing, frying, baking, grilling. So shiitake is really right across the range what you can do with an exotic mushroom.
When it comes to wild mushrooms, Jim, where do you get them from?
You get your wild mushrooms from individual retailers. You won't find those things in the supermarket chains. If you're a chef or a caterer or a providor, however, you can get them directly from the Great Australian Mushroom Company. Those wild mushrooms come from pickers across Australia, and they're identified on the spot, and they're identified again on the stand when they come through. So that is a very safe method of getting your wild mushrooms. However, if you're an unexperienced picker, you don't want to go into the wild and pick your own wild mushrooms.
Jim, the most dangerous mushroom in Australia, I believe, is Amanita phalloides. How do you tell Amanita phalloides?
Amanita phalloides is known as a death cap, and it is wrongly identified in its young stages as either a white button mushroom or a northern hemisphere straw mushroom. The way that you can definitely tell that an Amanita phalloides is a death cap is it has white gills as opposed to darker gills, and it has an onion bulb at the base. So if someone is picking, that's one thing that they definitely need to see.
Jim, why are mushrooms so good for you?
Mushrooms are a low-fat, high-protein, low-sugar way to get excellent micronutrients in your diet. They're a very flavorful addition to many foods, and they reduce the necessity to add salt to your food because they're a flavor enhancer. Mushrooms have several compounds. No, we don't want to say that. What are the things that I want to hit? I want to hit polysaccharides, beta-glucans. I want to say that stuff. Vitamin D. Yeah, let's say that.
They've been shown to act against breast cancer and prostate cancer.
Yep.
So work on the agaricus ones first.
Yep.
So start. The agaricus mushrooms have recently been shown in studies to da-da-da-da.
Yep.
And then talk about some of the medicinal properties, polysaccharides they're in a whole range of the exotic mushrooms plus some of the wild mushrooms in the Chinese stores.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jim, why are mushrooms so good for you?
Mushrooms have been shown in recent research to reduce the risk of breast cancer in women and prostate cancer in men. They've been also shown to... I lost all of that.
It's all right. It's all right. You want me to start again?
Let me just get it in my head real quick. So I'm going to talk about breast cancer.
You've already covered the first bit, about not using salt in your diet as much and all that sort of stuff.
I can cut that in. Yeah.
How else are mushrooms good for you, Jim?
I've lost myself here. Okay. Breast cancer, prostate cancer. What else are we?
Okay, I'll ask you a different one.
Yeah.
Jim, is it true that mushrooms have, or some mushrooms have, medicinal properties?
Yes, absolutely. Now, the medicinal properties can be attributed to a few features of the mushroom, particularly polysaccharides, other things such as beta-glucans, and then specifically to specific types of mushrooms, there are individual chemical compounds within different families. So there's a whole host of exotics and wild mushrooms that do provide medicinal benefits.
Okay, it's good for cholesterol, it's good for... I can't remember all the stuff it's good for. It's good for everything.
I think I could use some of that straight away.
What's that?
I should have been having it on you rather than on me at that time. I could have been using some of that straight away.
All right. Well, look, we can do one together. We get a third person here. We sit down together, and I can open that conversation. And we do one specifically on medicinal properties of mushrooms.
Yeah.
I can open and frame the conversation, and then bang to you for the detail.
Yeah.
And we'll restrict your detail per mushroom to 15 seconds.
Yeah.
And you might need a bit of practice doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because you don't need to have it all in.
Yeah.
And you want to tell people, well, look, there are fantastic sources of information. All you really have to do is Google medicinal mushrooms. And there's 70,000 or 80,000 entries on Google on the subject, and you can find many studies done in Japan, China, and now even the West on these medicinal mushrooms. Okay, so we don't need to do that now.
Okay.
We could do it. We could do it on the weekend. We could do it on the weekend with all those people there.
We should take that and get a bit. Yeah.
And get one of them to interview us, and we'll do a talk together. Or we get the three of us in, Richard, Wes, and Jim. That'll be a ripper.